Derek Todd. I lecture under contract within the department. I'm actually an environmental consultant who specialises in coastal applied research, something that I've done for about the last 25 years for catchment boards, regional councils, various consultancies, and now my own consultancy. So this is something that I do every day, and a lot of what I do in terms of consulting is to do with coastal hazards. So what I'll give you is the practical side of things rather than the academic side of things, how things work in practice and how they deviate from the theory to some degree, which the academics might be a little bit more interested in. Hence what I'll call this is theory and practice, because they are slightly different. Every time we go to do something, it's a slightly different setup, isn't it? So we'll do it this way. There we go. So what are we going to talk about today? What are coastal hazards? The definitions, the types, why we're interested in them from a New Zealand perspective, nationally, regionally. How do we manage them? The debate between engineering management and planning management. How are they handled under the Resource Management Act? Because it is a place where we are supposed to handle hazards, including coastal hazards. How do we map them? The techniques and the pitfalls of trying to map hazards. And then tomorrow we're going to look at some examples from Canterbury, various examples over the last 20 years of how they've been managed in different ways, and if we get time, one from Otago. And then next week I'm to talk about tsunamis, but I understand Chris has talked to you about tsunamis, isn't it? But so we might just skip some of the things that I might have talked about if he's already covered them. What I'll talk about in tsunamis is the response to them. I'm the regional tsunamis civil defence advisor, so whenever we get a tsunami warning in New Zealand, then I'm involved in the advisory capacity. So what are coastal hazards? Well, coastal obviously is the landforms which are formed by or directly influenced by contemporary marine processes. Those processes being primarily water level change due to tides, due to storm surge and waves. So something that is now directly affected by those processes or in the quite recent contemporary past. And that past could be over the Holocene, it could be over 10,000 years. So the sort of landforms we're interested in are beaches, coastal cliffs, river mouths, estuaries, harbours, reefs, those sorts of environments. For there to be a hazard, which I'm sure you've already covered in this course already, it's got to be the interaction between that event system and some use that we have, some asset or value we place on that coastal system, such that that physical component threatens that use. So for us, it's predominantly a land use on the coast. A lot of our coast is residential land use, and increasingly so. But we have a concentration of commercial uses of our coast, port companies. We have a large use of recreational use of our coast. And it might not just be the assets that you might put there, like surf buildings. It could be the fact, the opportunity to go fishing at a river mouth, for example. And we have a large amount of infrastructure strung along our coast. A lot of our major road systems, railway systems, pipe networks, and the majority of our sewer outfalls are located along our coast. So all of those things, when the natural processes interfere with those things, we get hazard. Obviously, Fiordland, why there's a large coast, there is very little hazard because there's very little human component to it. Yes, it does. So this sort of diagram encapsulates what we're looking at in terms of coastal hazards. They're caused by a number of causes, a series of causes and a number of drivers. So each of the causes, like sea level rise or tides or storms, can interact with any number of the drivers, all right, which are in there. And then they end up having two main sorts of hazard at the bottom. So coastal erosion is obviously one main sort. The landward retreat of beaches, of coastal cliffs and of sand spits can result in the loss of land, the loss of asset, or the loss of recreational opportunity. And then we have coastal inundation, being the other major hazard we might have, which is the flooding of the coastal hinterland by seawater. It's a hazard because it floods the asset, so it's more of a temporary hazard than a permanent hazard. We have loss of use, we have damage, and it's particularly damaging to our rural communities because seawater kills vegetation. and it takes it out of productivity for something like 5 years. So it's quite different from land flooding. Land flooding can be a benefit in some cases to our agriculture because we get a lot of silt and we get a lot of fresh growth. Seawater flooding tends to kill it and takes it totally out of production. As we said, each hazard can result from a number of drivers which may act in combination. So therefore, to try and quantify the level of risk involved in assessing a complex interaction of those processes is quite difficult. So for us to put things like engineers might want, like return periods of events, are quite hard because they can come from a multitude of ways. If we're looking at a river flood, return period of a river flood is relatively easy in those terms because it's just the relationship of rainfall, infiltration and runoff. A certain size sea storm is a combination of waves, tides, storm surge, antecedent conditions on our beach. All those things vary considerably. So to put a return period on a storm, a coastal storm or a coastal set of risk, is a lot more difficult. So I would be very wary if I was you reading anything that says return periods and coastal events. You can have a return period of a wave height that doesn't necessarily correspond to the return period of the storm. Because if it occurred during a neap tide, it would have a far less damaging effect than if it occurred during a spring tide. So we're interested in combinations of events to cause hazards. Coastal erosion. If we're looking at coastal erosion, we need to consider timescales. We can have long-term trends of change, such as this one. This is the Washtite Coast, just north of Timaru. And we can see it's galloped back around 400 odd metres between 1865 and to when this photograph was taken in about 1995. And we can, if we're trying to work out what is the long-term rate of retreat, we can take that 400 odd metres divided by 130 odd years and come up with a number of around about 3 metres a year. Or we can look at trends. We can use linear regression and sort of say, is it getting faster, is it getting slower? What is the time that what are the set of circumstances that it got faster or slower? So we need to, if we're talking about erosion, and you're reading anything about erosion, about long-term erosion, be very careful that you figure out what is it they're talking about. Is it first to last? Is it a trend? Is it really long-term? Because we have quite a lot of short-term sort of changes going on as well. Most of our erosion occurs in storms, so it's largely episodic. And that we have a storm event that causes a large change, then we sit stationary, or we actually get accretionary. So obviously when we measure erosion, then becomes important in terms of what sort of trend that we have. We have all sorts of other variations going on. Weather and climate fluctuations. We have seasonal change. We get more storminess, higher degrees of wave energy in our winter than we do in our summer. So we will get more erosion in our winter. So if we're always recording erosion in our winter, we will be maximising them. El Nino and La Nina effects, the 2 to 10 year effects, make a huge change on what our coast is doing. La Nino, more westerlies, which means more southeast depressions for us in the south coast, travelling up our coastline, which means more erosional events on the coast. It also means more floods in our alpine areas, delivering more sediment to our coast. So sometimes those things can be counterbalanced. La Nina, we have more subtropical cyclones, more easterly events, more likely to be damaging erosion on the east coast of the North Island. So where you are in New Zealand, the seasonal components or the climatic components will be different. And when we say the 1970s was a storminess, sort of stormy period, are we talking East Coast, are we talking West Coast, are we talking North Island, are we talking South Island? Because they were quite different. We have decadal oscillations, the IPO, the Inter-Pacific oscillations, which go on in 10 to 20 year oscillations of things that change in the Pacific, affect how much erosion we have. And then we have long-term changes such as climate warming. Right? So in reality, what our erosion picture or sea line picture normally looks something like this. And that we have the beach going up and down in some sort of trend that we can run a trend line through. So again, I say be very careful when you read any literature about coastal erosion. Is it recording a straight line through the middle? Is it just one point at the start, one point at the end? Is it a series of points? Had they started in an accretionary phase and ended in an erosional phase, which will give a greater rate of erosion? Or have they started the other way around, which will give less? Because what we're trying to use the past for is to project what the future might be like.